The Stranger in the Storm. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. An unexpected arrival, the autumn wind howled across the Montana plains, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Jake Morrison pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he made his final rounds of the evening, checking the cattle one last time before the storm hit. At 30 years old, he had been running the Morrison Ranch alone for nearly a decade, ever since his parents passed in a car accident that left him the sole heir to 3,000 acres of rolling grassland. The ranch was his sanctuary and his prison. He had inherited not just the land, but the isolation that came with it. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and his closest neighbor lived 15 miles down a dead road that became impassable during heavy rains. Jake had grown accustomed to the solitude, finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of ranch life, feeding the cattle, mending fences, maintaining equipment, and falling into bed exhausted each night. He had never minded being alone. In fact, he preferred. Social interactions had always been awkward for him, a tall, lanky boy who grew into a tall, broad-shouldered man, but never quite learned how to talk to people, especially women. His few attempts at dating during his early 20s had ended in embarrassing failures, and eventually he stopped trying altogether. The ranch gave him purpose, and purpose was enough, or so he had convinced himself. As he secured the barn doors against the approaching storm, Jake heard something unusual, the distant rumble of an engine struggling against the wind. He paused, listening intently. It was rare for anyone to venture out this far, especially with weather like this rolling in. The sound grew closer, and soon he could see headlights bouncing along the rotted driveway that led to his house. The vehicle, an old pickup truck that had seen better days, came to a sputtering stop near the barn. Jake watched from the shadows as the driver's door opened, and a figure emerged into the swirling dust and debris kicked up by the wind. Even in the dim light, he could tell it was a woman. She was small and slight, with long dark hair that whipped around her face as she struggled against the ghosts. She looked around uncertainly, then began walking toward the house. Jake stepped out of the shadows, his boots crunching on the gravel. The woman stopped abruptly when she saw him, her hand moving instinctively to her chest. "Sorry," Jake called out, raising his voice above the wind. "Didn't mean to startle you." She studied him for a moment, taking in his tall frame and weathered face. He was handsome in a rugged way, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something gentle about his expression despite his imposing size. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, stepping closer so she wouldn't have to shout. "My truck broke down about a mile back. I managed to get it started again, but I don't think it'll make it much further. I saw your lights and hoped." She trailed off, suddenly seeming to realize how her request might sound. "You need help," Jake said simply. It wasn't a question. He was hoping I could use your phone to call for a tow truck, but with this storm, she gestured helplessly at the darkening sky. The first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. Jake looked at her truck, then back at her. She was shivering, the weather from cold or nerves, he couldn't tell. She wore jeans and a thin sweater that offered little protection against the elements. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion. "Phone lines are probably down by now," he said. "They usually go out when the wind gets this bad. And no tow trucks coming out here tonight. Not in this weather." Her face fell, and Jake felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. He wasn't used to having his quiet world disrupted, but he couldn't send her back out into the storm. "Can I stay in your barn tonight?" she asked, the words coming out in a rush. "I have a sleeping bag in my truck. I just need somewhere dry to wait out the storm." Jake stared at her, his mind racing. He had never had a woman on his property before, never had anyone stay overnight. The idea made him nervous in ways he couldn't quite articulate. But the alternative, sending her away, was unthinkable. The barn's not heated, he said finally. You'll freeze. I'll be fine. I don't want to impose. You can stay in the house, Jake interrupted, surprising himself with the offer. I've got a spare room. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and weariness. Are you sure? I don't want to be any trouble. No trouble, Jake said, though his heart was beating faster than it had any right to. Come on, let's get you inside before this gets worse. As they hurried toward the house, Jake caught a whiff of her perfume, something light and floral that seemed completely out of place in his world of leather and high-end cattle. It made something stir deep in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He held the door open for her, and she stepped into his kitchen, looking around with curious eyes. The house was clean but sparse, furnished with practical pieces that had seen decades of use. It was a bachelor's home, functional, but lacking any feminine touches. In Jake Morrison, he said, suddenly realizing they hadn't been properly introduced. Emma, she replied, pulling off her jacket and hanging it on the back of a chair. Emma Chen. Thank you for this. Really, I know it's strange, a stranger showing up at your door. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Now that she was inside, in the warm light of his kitchen, he could see her more clearly. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. Delicate features, dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a mouth that curved naturally into a slight smile, even when she was clearly worried. Are you hungry? He asked, desperate to fill the silence. I was about to make some dinner. I don't want to put you out. It's no trouble. I always make too much anyway. It was a lie. He usually ate whatever was easiest, often standing at the counter. But something about her presence made him want to do better, to be better. As the storm raged outside, Jake found himself moving around his kitchen with uncharacteristic nervousness, acutely aware of Emma's every movement. She had settled at his kitchen table, and he could feel her watching him as he prepared a simple meal of steak and potatoes. You live here alone? She asked. Yeah. It's been just me for about 10 years now. That must get lonely. Jake paused in his cooking, considering her words. I'm used to it, he said finally, though for the first time in years, the admission felt like a lie. The storm continued to rage throughout the evening, rattling the windows and sending rain against the glass in sheets. Jake and Emma sat across from each other at his small kitchen table, the space between them charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. This is really good, Emma said, cutting into the perfectly cooked steak. You're a good cook. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks at the compliment. It's nothing fancy. Sometimes simple is best. She took another bite, then looked around the kitchen again. How long have you lived here?
My life.
This was my parents' place. My grandfather's before that. Jake found himself talking more than he had in months, maybe years. There was something about Emma that made conversation feel natural, despite his usual awkwardness. What about you? Where are you headed? Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Nowhere in particular. I'm just traveling. There was something in her tone that suggested she didn't want to elaborate. So Jake didn't push. He understood the need for privacy, for keeping certain things close to the chest. What do you do? On the fans? Emma asked, clearly wanting to change the subject. Cattle mostly, some horses. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest. Jake found himself studying her face as he spoke, noting the way her eyes lit up when she smiled, the small scar above her left eyebrow that only made her more interesting. I think there's something romantic about ranch life, Emma said. The connection to the land, the simplicity of it. Jake nearly choked on his water. No one had ever called his life romantic before. It's mostly just hard work and worry about weather and cattle prices, but you love it. It wasn't a question, and Jake realized she was right. Despite the challenges, despite the loneliness, he did love it. Yeah, I do. They talked through dinner and into the evening, the conversation flowing easier than Jake had ever experienced with another person. Emma told him about her travels, the small towns she'd passed through, the people she'd met. She had a way of describing things that made even mundane encounters sound like adventures. Jake found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone about his parents, about the challenges of running the ranch alone, about the satisfaction he found in the work. Despite its difficulties, Emma listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was really paying attention. As the evening wore on, Jake became increasingly aware of her presence in his space. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the sound of her laugh, warm and genuine. The way she moved with unconscious grace, even just reaching for her water glass. He had never felt anything like this before, this awareness of another person that seemed to electrify the very air around them. Every accidental brush of their hands, when she passed him a dish, sent a jolt through his system. When she smiled at him, really smiled, he felt something unfurl in his chest that he had never experienced. "He should probably let you get some rest," Emma said eventually, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 10, late by ranch standards. "Right," Jake said, though he was reluctant for the evening to end. "Let me show you to the spare room." He led her down the hallway, acutely aware of her following behind him. The spare room was small but clean, with a single bed and a dresser that had belonged to his grandmother. Jake had put fresh sheets on the bed while Emma was washing up after dinner, a task that had left him strangely nervous. "There are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "And the bathroom's just across the hall." "Thank you," Emma said softly, "for everything. I know this isn't how you planned to spend your evening." Jake looked at her standing there in his spare room, and something shifted inside him. "I'm glad you're here," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Emma's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment the air between them seemed to thicken. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs as they looked at each other across the small room. "Jake," Emma said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made his breath catch. But then she seemed to catch herself, stepping back slightly. "Good night," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Good night," Jake replied, though he made no move to leave the doorway. Finally, Emma reached for the door, and Jake had no choice but to step back. As the door closed between them, he stood in the hallway for a long moment, his mind reeling from the evening's events. In his own room, Jake lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm and thinking about the woman sleeping just down the hall. He had never felt desire before, not real desire, the kind that made your skin feel too tight and your thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. But lying there in the dark, he couldn't stop thinking about Emma's smile, her laugh, the way she had looked at him across the dinner table. He thought about the moment in the doorway, the electricity that had seemed to arc between them. Had he imagined it? Was he so inexperienced that he was reading things that weren't there? Down the hall, Emma lay in the narrow bed, equally sleepless. She had been running for 3 days, fleeing a life that had become unbearable, and she hadn't expected to find refuge with a lonely rancher who looked at her like she was something precious. There was something about Jake that called to her, his gentleness despite his size, his obvious loneliness that matched her own, the way he had opened his home to a stranger without hesitation. She had seen the way he looked at her during dinner with a mixture of wonder and nervousness that suggested he wasn't used to female company. There was an innocence about him that was both endearing and surprising in a man his age. It made her want to protect him, even as she felt drawn to him in ways that scared her. Emma had been hurt before, badly, and she had sworn off men and romance and all the complications they brought. But lying there in Jake's spare room, listening to the storm rage outside, she found herself thinking about the moment in the doorway when the air between them had seemed to shimmer with possibility. As the storm gradually began to subside in the early hours of the morning, both Jake and Emma finally drifted off to sleep, each dreaming of the other just down the hall. Jake woke before dawn, as was his habit, but for the first time in years, he didn't immediately get out of bed. Instead, he lay still, remembering that he wasn't alone in the house. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear morning that painted everything in shades of gold and amber. He could hear movement in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes, the whisper of footsteps on the old wooden floors. Emma was awake. The realization sent a flutter of nervousness through his stomach that he couldn't quite explain. When he finally made his way to the kitchen, he found Emma standing at the stove, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She had found his coffee and was making breakfast, moving around his kitchen with an ease that suggested she was comfortable in domestic spaces. "Good morning," she said, turning to smile at him. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to make breakfast as a thank you for last night." Jake stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. No one had cooked breakfast in his kitchen since his mother died. The sight of Emma, there, bathed in morning sunlight, made something itchy in his chest. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I wanted to." Emma turned back to the stove, where eggs were sizzling in a pan. "Besides, I'm an early riser. Old habits." Jake poured himself coffee from the pot she had made, noting that it was stronger than he usually made it, but somehow perfect. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in days," Emma admitted. "There's something peaceful about this place." They ate a breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, painting the kitchen in warm light. Jake found himself watching Emma's face, noting the way the shadows under her eyes had lessened, how she seemed more relaxed than she had the night before. "You should probably look at your truck," Jake said. "Eventually. See if it's something I can fix." Emma's face fell slightly. "Right. I should get out of your hair." "I didn't mean," Jake started, then stopped. What had he meant? That she should stay? That he wasn't ready for her to leave? "Let me just take a look. Maybe it's something simple." They walked out to where Emma's truck sat in his driveway, looking forlorn in the morning light. Jake popped the hood and immediately saw the problem, a broken belt and what looked like a blown gasket. "How far were you planning to go?" he asked, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag. "I don't know," Emma said quietly. "Just away." There was something in her voice that made Jake look at her more closely. In the clear morning light, he could see things he had missed the night before. A fading bruise on her wrist, the way she held herself as if ready to run, the sadness that lurked behind her smiles. "Emma," he said carefully, "are you running from something?" She was scared for a long moment, staring at the broken truck. "Someone," she said finally. "My ex-husband. He doesn't like to let things go." Jake felt something cold and angry unfurl in his chest. "Did he hurt you?" Emma's hand moved unconsciously to her wrist, covering the bruise. "It doesn't matter now. I just need to keep moving." "It does matter." The words came out harder than Jake intended, and Emma looked up at him in surprise. "I'm sorry. It's just, no one should hurt you." They stood there in the morning sunlight, looking at each other across the broken truck. Jake had never felt protective of anyone before, but looking at Emma, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide, made him want to stand between her and whatever had hurt her. "The truck's going to need parts," he said finally. "It'll take a few days to get them out here, maybe longer." Emma's face went pale. "I can't stay here that long. I can't put you in danger." "What kind of danger?" "If David finds me, let him come," Jake said, and he meant it. The thought of someone hunting Emma, of someone who had hurt her tracking her to his ranch, filled him with a cold fury he had never experienced. Emma stared at him. "You don't understand. He's not a good man. He has connections, resources. He won't just give up." "Neither will I," Jake said simply. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. When was the last time someone had offered to protect her? When had anyone ever looked at her the way Jake was looking at her now, like she was worth fighting for? Why, she whispered. Why would you do that for a stranger? Jake stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. You don't feel like a stranger, he said quietly. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. The same electricity that had sparked the night before, but stronger now, more insistent. Emma felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by something she couldn't name. Jake, she said, his name barely a whisper. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with gentle fingers. Emma's eyes fluttered closed at the contact, and Jake felt his breath catch at her response. He said, the word carrying more weight than either of them was prepared for. Please, at least until the track is fixed. Emma opened her eyes, searching his face. What she saw there, the sincerity, the unexpected strength, the desire he was trying so hard to hide, made her decision for her. Okay, she said softly, I'll stay. The next few days passed in a haze of discovery for both Jake and Emma. She insisted on helping with the ranch work, despite his protest that she was a guest. Emma proved surprisingly capable, helping with the horses and even assisting with fence repairs. Jake found himself looking forward to her company during the long days, their easy conversation making familiar tasks feel new and interesting. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Emma would tell him stories of the places she had been, while Jake shared the history of the land, pointing out landmarks and explaining the rhythms of ranch life. These conversations often stretched late into the night, neither wanting to break the spell of intimacy that seemed to surround them. On the third day, Jake drove into town to order the parts for Emma's truck. The trip that usually took him an hour stretched to 3, as he found himself reluctant to leave her alone, even for a short time. When he returned, he found Emma in the kitchen, baking bread from scratch. Where did you learn to do that? He asked, breathing in the warm, yeasty smell that filled the house. My grandmother, Emma said, kneading the dough with practiced hands. She said a woman should know how to make a home wherever she finds herself. The word home hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Jake watched her work, noting the way she moved with unconscious grace, how she had somehow made his sparse kitchen feel warm and welcoming. Emma, he said quietly, can I ask you something? She nodded, not looking up from her work. What was your life like before? Emma's hands stilled on the door. Complicated, she said finally. I married young to someone my parents approved of. David was successful, charming when he wanted to be. For a while I thought I was happy. What changed? It did. Or maybe I just finally saw who he really was. Emma resumed kneading, her movements more aggressive now. He needed to control everything, where I went, who I talked to, what I wore. When I started pushing back, she trailed off, but Jake could fill in the blanks. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, as he imagined someone hurting her, controlling her. How long were you married? 5 years. I tried to leave twice before, but he always found me, always convinced me to come back. This time is different, though. This time I'm not going back. Jake heard the determination in her voice, but also the fear. What makes this time different? Emma looked up at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I finally found something worth running to instead of just running away. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He stared at her across the kitchen. This woman who had stumbled into his life and turned everything upside down. The desire he had been fighting for days suddenly seemed less frightening than the thought of her leaving. Emma, he said, stepping closer.
She set down the dough and turned to face him fully. I know this is crazy, she said quickly. I know we barely know each other, but I feel something here that I've never felt before. You make me feel safe, but more than that, you make me feel like myself again.
Jake reached for her then, his hand settling on her waist. She was so small, so delicate, but he could feel the strength in her, the courage it had taken to leave everything behind and start over. "I've never felt anything like this before," he admitted. "I don't know what I'm doing." Emma smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "Neither do I. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure it out together." When Jake kissed her, it was with all the pent-up longing of a man who had never known desire until now. Emma melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as she kissed him back with equal fervor. It was awkward at first, Jake's inexperience showing, but Emma guided him gently, showing him what she liked, what made her gasp and press closer. They broke apart, breathing hard, staring at each other in wonder. "Are you sure?" Jake asked, his voice rough with want. "I don't want to take advantage." Emma silenced him with another kiss, pouring all her certainty into the contact. When they broke apart again, she took his hand and led him toward the stairs. What happened next was tender and passionate, awkward and perfect, all at once. Jake's inexperience was evident, but his gentleness, his obvious reverence for her body, made Emma feel cherished in a way she had never experienced. She guided him patiently, showing him how to touch her, how to love her, until they were both lost in sensation and emotion. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Jake's bed, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Emma traced patterns on Jake's chest, while he ran his fingers through her hair, both of them marveling at this new intimacy. "What happens now?" Jake asked quietly. Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she said finally. "The track parts will come eventually. David is still out there looking for me. Then we'll deal with it," Jake said firmly. Together, Emma lifted her head to look at him. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I love you," Jake said simply, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I know it's too soon, I know it's crazy, but I do. I love you, and I want you to stay, not just until the truck is fixed permanently." Emma felt tears spill over at his words. "I love you too," she whispered. "But what if David finds us? What if he tries to hurt you?" "Let him try," Jake said, his arms tightening around her. "This is my land, my home, and you're mine now if you'll have me." Emma kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. "Yes," she said against his lips. "Yes, I'll have you." Outside, the wind whispered across the plains, carrying with it the promise of change. But inside the old ranch house, two people who had been lost had finally found their way home, not to a place but to each other. 3 months later, Emma's truck still sat in the barn. Its parts finally arrived, but never installed. She had found something better than escape. She had found love, safety, and a future she had never dared to dream of. And Jake, the lonely rancher who had never known desire until a stranger appeared at his door, had discovered that sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them. The ranch was no longer his sanctuary and prison. It was their home, filled with laughter and love and the promise of all the tomorrows they would face together.